Hello and welcome to the Exeter Impact Podcast, where we host engaging conversations with research experts, sharing their insights, approaches and solutions for advancing impact of research at the University of Exeter and beyond. Our episodes cover diverse flagship research across academic departments and impact types. Tune in every month to learn about planning and embedding research impact and opportunities to develop your impact portfolio. The podcast is developed and hosted by me, Emma Sheriff, an Impact Evidence and Evaluation Officer at the university. Episodes are made available for staff to listen or watch via the Impact Community of Practice SharePoint site and linked in the Exeter Weekly Bulletin. Welcome, Joe.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast.
Very happy to.
Can you tell us about how you came to be interested in film history and your academic background, please?
Yes, of course. Yeah, I began my academic life as an English literature student, actually, in the long distant past. And working through that, I became more and more interested in cinema as I went. And I became more and more interested in modern media. They felt more vibrant to me, something I wanted to pursue. Eventually, I did a PhD, which was about early cinema, which is to say cinema between about 1896 and about 1910. But of course, what tends to happen is these things, you begin with a narrow focus and then they broaden out without you intending them ever to do so. And then you have to narrow them in again and then they broaden out again. And sort of through the, 5 or 10 years, after my PhD, I gradually became more and more interested. And I'm now a professor of film and visual media because I'm really, really interested. Not just in film, but also in all the other media that surrounded it. I mean, there's a modern word which I sometimes use. It's just transmedia. But I like to see it as a sort of a long historical phenomenon. So I'm very interested in 19th century media, right the way back to, the 1820s and even before that, through the 19th century, through the early period. And actually, right the way through, my teaching is about film, primarily, which is a 20th, 21st century phenomenon. But I'm equally interested in modern media. You can imagine, right, if you're thinking about media, that's a concept, the idea of the face, how it expresses things, which crosses all those historical periods, all those media, and it becomes a nice example of the way in which transmedia can work. That's my research, and I got into it like many people do. I didn't quite fall into it, but it kind of happened to me.
So interesting, and it makes perfect sense. Communication through the ages.
Absolutely, yes, absolutely. Communication is right.
So your recent work on A Million Pictures has been particularly impactful. Can you explain how you came to lead the work and what you hoped at the outset to achieve?
Yes, of course. I mean, it's another, I suppose, long story. As I said, out of that history of my sort of development as a scholar, as an academic, as I pushed my way towards becoming someone more interested in, as I'm calling it, transmedia across the years, I encountered many, many collections. Now, I began life as what they call a theorist, which is to say that I dealt with a lot of abstractions and concepts, ways of thinking about how people communicate. Good word, right? Because I found it was common very often across all those multiple media, those histories that are connected up in different ways. Those things, though, they're really conditioned. They have to be by what, it's a difficult phrase, believe it or not, to use, but what actually happened. And actually, one of the things I discovered about historical media in particular, 19th century and early 20th century, is that we don't really know, or we didn't. We're beginning to understand more and more as we go through our researches. So, as resources opened up, as museums became more and more aware, heritage collections of different kinds and libraries, of what they actually had on the books, what was behind the work, I began to realize that the way I worked with concepts had to be conditioned by the concepts that were held by the people who first used these things. And it changes everything. It changes the way that you think about, some of the very abstract ideas which have governed the way that we think that something like, say, a film actually works, the way we watch things. Because when you revisit the early cinema, when you revisit the media which just preceded it, you realize that people weren't watching in anything like the same kind of way. It meant something different to them. Sometimes it's compared to the way that people watch YouTube or some of the social media channels. There are comparisons to be made there which are just as valid, just as compelling. So my work getting into this sort of material has been a sort of a journey which began with that kind of shift into still theoretical material, but now informed by the histories, now more varied, now open to all the different kinds of varieties of practice which actually existed, which you can still talk about in general. And it allowed me to start going, and this is the point, and archival collections where what I discovered very quickly was that not only are there sort of, abstract records, newspaper reports about people giving shows or watching them, or the occasional diary entry, there are still not only early films, but there are, and this is the big step, I suppose, literally millions of magic lantern slides, which nobody can do anything with. And I became increasingly aware of the fact that museums were harbouring, and that isn't the wrong word actually, they were holding on to vast collections, sometimes tens of thousands strong, of magic lantern glass plate slides, which they really couldn't use because they're too fragile, too delicate to bring out. They can't be held or touched by the public. If you put them just into a display case, they don't really show their colours. They look like rather dull little objects. These things leap into life when they're projected. So what I saw was, well, that's not quite true. I didn't think this is untold potential at first. I thought that's amazing. These things are beautiful. And there are people who still screen them around as well, and we can see how beautiful they are, particularly in use, particularly when narrated or with music or with entertainments of all sorts. And it became quite apparent, actually, that what had to happen was some form of recovery. Some form of recovery which led to some forms of reuse. That was my route in. So, I mean, that sounds long, perhaps over complex, but in the end, it came down to the idea that there are these giant collections which museums weren't properly able to use, didn't even know what they had often. And that was something which I realized I could help with. And it's a lovely moment, actually, to realize that, your academic books, they might reach an audience of people who are like-minded, have interests to you. But this was material which was designed to reach everybody all at once. And coming across that was the change.
What stakeholders did you identify beyond the university and perhaps internationally to engage with the research?
This was where, I suppose, with hindsight, I'd landed on my feet. With hindsight, these weren't completely unknown, these collections. But there really was that moment where they were being discovered, and sometimes they were being altogether removed from collections. Large collections were getting rid of this material without really capitalizing or realizing what they had. I'd landed on my feet because, as I said, it was intended for the public. So it was actually relatively straightforward to identify stakeholders. Stakeholders just had to be, in the first instance, there were more than this, but initially they just had to be people working in heritage collections who had an interest in finding out what they had, probably had an inkling that it was attractive, even if they didn't know quite how, had seen the images, had projected light behind them at least and seen what they were and thought, that's marvellous. But didn't necessarily immediately have the knowledge or the means to do anything about it. So, in essence, the project was as big as it could be. It could have been a massive project involving, dozens, hundreds of collections, because that's how many there are. But we had to be quite selective in picking those who really, really wanted to be involved, who really, really had an interesting variety of material we could look at, and which allowed us to get a little bit of coverage of what was going on. So it was places like from a relatively small institution like Chetham's Library in Manchester, which has a relatively small collection of quite specific lantern slides. Also in Manchester, the Manchester Museums Group have an absolutely immense university collection. Locally, the Royal Albert Memorial Museum has an excellent sort of, I wouldn't call it provincial, but it is a large collection of slides of all sorts, which they have. The Royal Geographic Society has an amazing collection of, nationally and internationally important slides collected by explorers and other people who might present their material later on. So, and it goes on from there. There's quite a long list of people who we have worked with in order to bring those slides forward, both for the collections, and that's where the key is, but also for ourselves to bring them to the public through our own database.
And did you have a specific impact goal in mind for the work when you were planning the research?
Initially, the impact goal was one of recovery, and we wanted to recover slides from as broad a selection of places as possible. That included international collections. We worked across Australia, we worked across institutions in Europe as well, and the British ones I've mentioned too. But recovery is really, really interesting in and of itself, just simply because there's so much material out there, just putting it into the public domain in some way. And because we digitize the material, it straight away lifts out that fundamental primary issue with glass plate slides, which is that you can break them. And it allows you to capture it these days in as attractive a way as you possibly can. Those are all really, really important things because they do bring it before a general public. They do allow that to happen. But over time, it became quite apparent, actually, that more important than recovery was allowing reuse. Digitization is a part of that. It is a part of that for the heritage collections too, because they want to be able to access their own materials. They want to know what they have. So that work of cataloguing is vital. It enables them to take the material forward and use it in new and unexpected ways, and that is exactly what they've done. They put on their own shows. It's allowed even forms of particular kinds of marketing of the materials that they already have, which they didn't know about. But perhaps the most important thing there is that in taking that material forward, they're engaging with a much wider public than I could have imagined at the beginning. So coming back to the question, the point with the impact was that what emerged was we realized that we were enablers. We began as people thinking, well, we're going to do this all ourselves. We had impact events set up. And there's nothing wrong with that. We carried on doing them. We set up our own shows. We set up our own sort of exhibits, and we worked with the museums in all sorts of ways. But then what was really striking was how they took it forward. Because once they knew what they had, once they had a decent repository of both digital artifacts which they could map onto the real things, they could not only open up those research collections, but they started doing all sorts of shows for themselves. They started using the images in new ways in their publicity. The Royal Albert Memorial Museum has done so many things with lantern slides now, children's shows, magic shows, an Alice in Wonderland show, all sorts of things. And that's the most gratifying thing.
Very rewarding, I imagine.
It is absolutely. And, I laugh about it because the work itself was quite hard work. It took a long time. There's a lot of day-to-day grind around it. But in the end, when places like museums across the world and locally take the material and take it forward in a way which you didn't expect, it's massively rewarding. And I didn't have to put anything into that. It is simply that to begin with, you listen. They know they have the material. You show them what they have, and then they begin to think some more and say, well, this is what we could do. And then you start working, and the work is partly for them. And if you've done that work of getting things in place so that they can take it forward, then that work is actually theirs. That's what they wanted to do in the first place. And it is very rewarding, that's probably, I would say, impact is an abstract noun, right? But actually it's a material thing where people are changing their day-to-day lives because of the things that you've done for them.
You mentioned your stakeholders there, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about the challenges. So were there any specific challenges you faced in working with such a diverse range of stakeholders, and how did you address that with them?
Yeah, that's probably the most important first step. So the thing about working the way we have is that it involves multiple stakeholders, particularly in heritage collections, not just heritage collections, but we're thinking about them. I've talked about it again as a way in which you're working with people to see how they can take things forward. But the point is that every collection, every stakeholder is very different. It's very rare that we find that museums and collections want exactly the same thing. Now, because we're working with some very small local collections as well as some very large national collections like the Royal Geographic Society, they want different numbers of things digitized. They want different material put together. They also want to do different things with it. I mentioned Chetham's Library in Manchester. So to give you an example, they have a really, what I would call a very focused but very narrow collection. It's quite wide in some ways. There are lots of slides, and many of them are associated with a single person who donated many years ago, a guy called Phelps, who used to give lectures using dozens and dozens of magic lantern slides, was very interested in local history and other forms of history. And they still have the lecture notes, which are lovely. That's what I mean by very focused. They've got all the material there in one place. But those lectures, if you were to read them out, they would be sort of 3 hours, I think.
Okay.
This isn't something which you would imagine would easily be simply reproduced. But what the materials have done is it's allowed Chetham's to do all sorts of outreach projects to people who are interested in local history, often to underprivileged groups, who are looking at material from across the 19th, early 20th centuries and are able to present it in new ways and engage in it in different ways as well. So this was an example of a stakeholder where we thought, okay, this is a focused collection, and we were quite thoughtful about what might be useful for them. And they were quite thoughtful about what might be most useful for them. So there's that initial step. The challenge is to listen. I don't mean that to sound as pat as it probably does. The challenge is to listen because, of course, I had aims. And the project had aims, and we had sort of goals to satisfy of our own. You do have to balance those things up. But so many of them are actually met by the point at which you are going into whatever the stakeholder is, for me, a collection or a performer, perhaps, if we're working with a particular performer, and ask, what is it that you need? And then it can be slightly transactional in the sense of, this is what we need. We'd like some of your images as well. We'd like to put those up on our database to some extent, but we'll give you a certain set of images too. Or it can simply be that the two things chime together, but only once you've asked. But if you've not done that, if you've not taken that initial step of working with the individual stakeholder, all with the different demands, then you're left actually with a rather one-noted endpoint, which was yours to begin with, which is less usable by the people. And it kind of undercuts that moment where people start taking things and doing them for themselves.
I wonder how you've approached engaging with the cultural and education sectors during the research. You've mentioned a little bit there about the challenges, but how do you kind of prepare to do that, and what does that involve?
Well, it involves being very thoughtful. I mean, I've talked a bit about the heritage and the heritage sector, the cultural heritage sector. I guess another example would be working with live performers, people who want to use magic lantern slides, and they come in different styles as well. The trick of work, if we take the sort of the culture industries to start with, we have found is that kind of openness of the same kind. With creative performers, the important point is to allow them to take the material forward in any way which suits them, because they're artists. And pointing out that Mr. Phelps gave 3-hour lectures involving large numbers of black and white lantern slides is fine. They're interested to see that, but then they want to take that material, they want to reuse it, they want to present it in ways that suit them best. So the beginning point of working with the cultural industries for us, well, there's publicity around the sorts of magazines and places where you're putting the material, because it, in my case, it is uniquely visual. It works very well in that sort of a format. So it was quite easy to get that material out. And then it's responding quite quickly to people who are signalling an interest and following those things up, finding out what might happen. We worked extensively with a chap called Tony Liddington, who at the time, and still is working for his own company, Promenade Promotions. So he generated, fascinatingly, he already had a movable peep show which he constructed.
Okay.
So a very large thing he'd stick on the back of a truck, and he'd take it to festivals, he'd take it to various places. It's a very old-fashioned entertainment. It derives from the 18th century, and he's generated all sorts of new mechanisms for using it. And he wanted to incorporate some of our slides. And he did that using the material that we produced. We were able to allow him to do this in the RAM and locally and in festivals up and down the country. But it was that kind of moment of listening to what he needed, finding a way of engaging with it, which was to provide material, provide information and evidence, to even talk to him about the idea of showmanship, because he was a showman. And, you feel you're definitely a bit of an intruder in that context because he knows exactly what showmanship is, but he doesn't necessarily verbalize it. But just to engage on those sorts of levels is sort of multiply useful in all sorts of directions, I find. In terms of education, our reach is largely generated really by the big database. So the database pre-existed, but we were able to sort of generate a new sort of identity for it. We set up a KIC, a community interest company, which gives it a legal status. And although that sounds dry as dust, it is in fact massively important to allow a body such as that to have an independent legal existence. It can have its own bank account. It can do things independently as well. It's set up its own panel with its own chair, and it's self-directed to a large extent. So it worked in partnership the whole time, being another kind of impact, if that makes sense. Because it now has a sort of a potential for a sustainable future, one which is entrepreneurial for sure, but which works in all those sorts of ways. So we work quite heavily to set those things up.
Yes. And I think you've talked there in quite a lot of detail about the forms of evidence you've collected, which is really useful for some of our listeners who will be wanting to compile an impact case study for the next ref. With that in mind, what would you advise an academic who is keen to produce a case study for the next ref?
Well, I guess a lot of it is implicit in some of the things I've said. Be open-minded. Obviously, you start at the beginning. That tends to mean starting small. It tends to mean starting with, projects differ greatly, right? But sometimes if there's a multitude of possible partners, then you start small with one, and you progress with that, and you take that forward, and you move things ahead in that sort of a way. But always keep in mind the range of contacts that you might make. Don't be chary of communicating with other people who might have some sort of set of interests or some different stake in the sorts of things that you're doing. Always be, this is just a principle in life, right? But always be responsive when people are asking you questions, and make sure that you're able to sort of take that to its logical conclusion, even if that is 2 emails and you're done. It might actually be much more than that. It might prove to be one of the, as with our case study, it might prove to be one of the central sort of planks that emerges. We had, you mentioned problems earlier, and I didn't mention, we did have collections who dead keen, and dropped out, money fell away, or their ability to engage in some other way sort of fell away. But the openness that we'd already had meant that we were in contact with lots and lots of people. So we were able to sort of change gears slightly with no damage or harm at all. It was simply a matter of rolling with those punches, finding a way to generate impacts with somebody, even if it wasn't the one which you initially had expected.
Imagined.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. I suppose that's the central piece of advice. And on top of that, this, I don't know, this perhaps is, I really enjoyed this material. It's one of the things in my academic life I've enjoyed the most, and I think it's worth saying that probably. Because, like I said before, it can feel like a really, really abstract term, impact. Impact as a noun, because it has to cover so many different things, because it has to cover so many different practices. It has to be written about in those general sorts of ways. But in reality, it is very much about engaging with people in a much more open way. If you're able to, the abstract stuff will come, but if you're able to form those sorts of partnerships and to generate real work in a way which changes other people's lives in ways which sometimes you predict and sometimes they come along on their own, I think that's my great optimistic message about it. I think it's one of the most valuable things I've done in my career, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would recommend it.
Is there one single piece of advice that you could offer to individual researchers to act on to ensure their research impact is achieved?
Yeah, I'm trying to narrow down, actually. One piece of advice to an individual researcher, I would suggest that you keep an eye on your research process. I'm thinking about right at the beginning. So much of what I just said was about being in the midst of it. There's a point where it starts to roll, and that could be in identifying a partner of some sort, or it might be your own sort of thoughts about reaching the public in general, whatever it is. But right at the beginning, before all of that, you are doing your own research. You're doing it because you find it fascinating in some way, we hope.
Yes.
That's the ideal, right? And in that sense, it's a great privilege. Being open-minded about reaching not 300 people, but 30,000 people. Reminding yourself that your work has that sort of reach, and then thinking about ways in which you can permit that to happen, which can be one of those engagement activities. It can be, interviews. It can be publicity of that sort. It can also be something which is grounded more in other people's professional lives. That's true in the university and outside of it. So it's that kind of, the spark for me was seeing these huge collections of Magic Lantern slides and wondering why no one could see them. So in some senses, very obvious, but yet not done. Or at least not done very much, not done by people in the situation I was in. But it could be all sorts of things, clearly. And just being alive to that possibility of reaching people who you hadn't thought you could reach. That's probably the main piece of advice I give to people who are thinking that at some point they would like to do something like this.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I think that's a really good note for us to bring the podcast to a close. We really appreciate your time today. So thank you to Joe and thank you to our listeners. You can access the details of our departmental impact workshops via the episode links for support to plan an impact case study in readiness for the next REF.